one thing that's arguably worse than a dreadful horror movie is a boring one, and it does happen. There are several slashers, ghost stories, and found footage flicks that seemingly disappeared into the ether entirely. There are a couple of horrors that are so impressively bland, it's challenging to recall a single thing about them. Even if you've seen the movies on this list, you may draw a blank when trying to recollect the twist, the ending, or the story in general. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie for What Culture, and here are 10 horror movies everyone watched, but nobody remembers. Number 10, The Ring 2. Ring and Ju-on the Grudge made serious waves upon their initial release since they were among the first Asian horrors to break into the American mainstream. These spooky nerve shredders proved so popular, they both received a Western remake a few years later. When Gore Verbinski's The Ring recouped its budget 5 times over, it looks like Japanese horror remakes were going to be the next big thing. Instead, the fad fizzled out just as suddenly as it started. The original contained many iconic moments, including the first death, the tape itself, and Samara's final reveal. The only thing about The Ring 2 that got anybody talking was a bizarre scene involving hostile deer. The main reason why this sequence stands out is because the special effects are so distractingly terrible. To be fair, it's understandable why a sequel was greenlit, considering The Ring made a sizable profit. However, the end result is such a bore, it would have been better if the brand was left alone. Number 9, I'll Always Know What You Did Last Summer. Based on the 1973 novel of the same name, I Know What You Did Last Summer follows a group of teens who find themselves being hunted by the man called Ben Willis, who they left for dead the previous year. The delightfully campy slasher made a killing at the box office, encouraging the studio to rush out a sequel the following year. I Still Know What You Did Last Summer was awful, but it's debatably more memorable thanks to its ludicrous plot holes, dumb twist, and Jack Black's over-the-top performance. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said about the follow-up. To its credit, I'll Always Know What You Did Last Summer tried doing something different. Rather than churning out the same old, the story focuses on a new set of characters. Also, having Ben Willis reborn as a vengeful zombie puts a supernatural spin on the dwindling property. However, the paranormal angle is barely explored in this woeful threequel, since Ben is only revealed as a ghoul during the climax. And thanks to the insufferable ensemble, unimaginative kills, laughable dialogue, and shoddy filmmaking, there's nothing redeemable about this trash. Number 8, Leatherface, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. Tobe Hooper's classic slasher, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is still one of the most celebrated horrors of all time. The sequel initially received mixed reviews, but has since developed a cult following thanks to its zany characters, over-the-top action, and elaborate set pieces. And then there's Leatherface, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. Simply put, nothing of interest occurs in this threequel, which is why nobody really talks about it. Even though Texas Chainsaw Massacre purists should have seen every installment in the franchise, nothing springs to mind when discussing this entry. Despite the fact the follow-up, The Next Generation, is inarguably worse, it's more memorable due to Matthew McConaughey's ludicrous performance and that weird Illuminati subplot. But since Massacre 3 can't even be classified as so bad it's good, it got lost in the shuffle. Number 7, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. After the success of Bram Stoker's Dracula, it was no surprise when Frankenstein got adapted once again to the big screen. With Kenneth Branagh directing, Frank Darabont co-writing, and Robert De Niro portraying the creature, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein seemed destined for great things. But much like the creature itself, what should have been a beautiful creation turned out ugly and malformed. There are nuggets of greatness here and there, but the scenes range from unbearably dull to overbearingly manic, so we're left with a maligned mess of a movie. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein followed the source material far closer than the Boris Karloff version, but failed to capture the complexity and subtlety of the novel. And when Darabont himself called it, quote, the worst movie I've ever seen, you know somebody screwed up big time. Number 6, House on Haunted Hill. The late 90s and early millennium saw a string of 50s horror movies getting rebooted, including The Haunting, 13 Ghosts, and House on Haunted Hill. 13 Ghosts wasn't received favourably, but has since become a cult classic. The Haunting remake was atrocious, but is still remembered, mainly because of how unintentionally hilarious it is. Despite the fact 1999's House on Haunted Hill wasn't as bad as The Haunting, and made a reasonable profit, it's fallen off everybody's radar. Like the original, the supernatural thriller revolves around an eccentric mogul called Stephen Price, who offers 5 guests a huge fortune if they stay one night in a haunted hospital. When things start going bump in the night, the contestants can't tell if their host is playing tricks on them or if the building is infested with murderous phantoms. Some moviegoers mightn't know what's going on either, even if they've seen the film, since House on Haunted Hill offers few engaging characters, cool deaths, or interesting twists. Apart from Jeffrey Rush's scene-chewing performance, the spooky B-movie is a schlocky snooze fest. Number 5. Curse of La Llorona. The Conjuring franchise has been a monumental success, raking in over $2 billion collectively, making it the most successful horror series to date. One of the reasons why the IP did well is because it created a cinematic universe organically, rather than tossing out sequel after sequel. The studio took notice of which characters the fanbase were drawn to, inspiring them to create spin-offs revolving around those characters. Sadly, that wasn't the case for The Curse of La Llorona. Though the folk horror centers around another ghostly antagonist, it had no real connection with The Conjuring. But the problem with cinematic universes, and any Marvel fan can validate this, is that Conjuring advocates flocked to the theaters to see La Llorona, believing it would tie into the franchise and expand the lore. The Curse of La Llorona made a fortune, but that's only because moviegoers saw it out of obligation rather than genuine desire. But if you had to ask viewers what happened in this unnecessary offshoot, you'll struggle to get a detailed answer. The Conjuring has had its fair share of misfires, but The Curse of La Llorona is the blandest of the lot. Number 4. Gothika. Halle Berry was the it girl during the early millennium, starring in superhero blockbusters, James Bond, and Academy Award-winning movies. As such, there was a decent amount of hype for Gothika, with Berry starring in the lead role. In this mystery thriller, Berry plays a psychiatrist called Miranda Gray, who becomes an inmate in her own asylum when she's accused of murdering her husband. After speaking to fellow inmates and having multiple ghostly encounters, Miranda starts piecing together the events that led to her husband's death. Now, the main reason why a film is forgettable is because it's too generic. But Gothika's main problem is how overly complicated the plot is. There's a lot to take in, since the story deals with vengeful spirits, snuff movies, possessions, and an extremely convoluted cover-up. Also, the glaring plot holes make it hard to pay attention to what's happening half the time. Who would incarcerate a doctor in her own institution and let her bunk with her ex-patient? I mean, come on! Number 3. Diary of the Dead and Survival of the Dead. George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead is responsible not just for launching the zombie maestro's career, but jolting the undead genre to life. Though Romero's franchise spawned a slew of copycats, few can compete with his work. So when the revered filmmaker returned to the franchise after a 20-year hiatus with Land of the Dead, fans were salivating with joy. And when Romero mentioned he had more dead films in the pipeline, the hype went through the stratosphere. Though Romero was true to his word, it's easy to forget the last 2 Dead installments ever came out. Diary of the Dead focuses on how the zombie outbreak began, which hasn't been explored since the original. This entry also utilizes the found footage style, which was something Romero had intended for years due to his fascination with emerging media. However, the filming is too slick for a found footage doc. You have to wonder why Romero was dead set on applying the real-time documentary method if he refused to commit to it. Although Diary of the Dead was disappointing, it had some interesting ideas. The follow-up, on the other hand, Survival of the Dead, is shockingly devoid of creativity. The characters have zero survival instincts, the zombies have never looked worse, and the kills are insultingly fake. And since Survival of the Dead was the last movie Romero ever directed, it makes the viewing experience all the more depressing. Number 2. Night Watch. For the longest time, Timur Bekmambetov didn't have much luck when it came to directing. Not only did the Russian filmmaker's movies consistently receive poor reviews, few of them saw the light of day outside his homeland. As a result, there shouldn't have been much anticipation surrounding 2004's Night Watch, an urban fantasy where the forces of light and dark wage a secret war against each other. But when Quentin Tarantino and Danny Boyle sang its praises, Night Watch started being plugged like crazy. The vampiric thriller ended up earning 10 times its budget and became the most successful Russian release ever. It also made Bekmambetov a more prolific director, allowing him to tackle Hollywood pictures like Wanted, Ben-Hur, and Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. Looking back, Night Watch seemed like a total success, and yet it hasn't really left a lasting effect. Also, can anyone remember what happened? There was a bad guy who fought people with his spine, and that is pretty much it. Although there was a lot of preemptive excitement for Night Watch, it had completely died down by the time the sequel came out. Number 1. White Noise. Michael Keaton has had an enormously diverse career over the last 4 decades, portraying featuring superheroes, supervillains, clones, historical figures, bioexorcists, a snowman, and the only good character in the RoboCop remake. But while reflecting on the Beetlejuice star's acting credits, white noise rarely gets brought up. Jeffrey Sachs's first theatrical feature centers around an architect called Jonathan Rivers, who falls into a depression after his wife drowns. After speaking to a mysterious man called Raymond Price, Jonathan learns the voices of spirits can be detected on sound equipment. Desperate to speak with his wife, Jonathan becomes obsessed with electronic voice phenomena, which leads to all sorts of problems. Now, EVP was a fascinating topic in the paranormal community at the time, which is why white noise ended up earning nearly 10 times its budget. So why doesn't anybody remember it? Well, simply put, it's really boring. After watching Keaton's character listening to static for 14 scenes in a row, even the most patient viewers will be bored to tears.